Hello and welcome to Round Table. Cold War II may already be upon us, although this time around, instead of an arms race between the US, its allies, and Russia, it involves economic sanctions, accusations of internal political meddling, cyber warfare, and proxy wars in places such as Syria. They are the new weapons of choice, but not everybody wants to join this geopolitical fight. Good to have you along. I'm David Foster. The conflict in Ukraine is the most recent instance where Western and Russian tensions are playing out. But while the US and European countries have been unified in isolating and sanctioning Russia, many in the so-called global south are not on board. As the economic crisis bites harder, support for the West will be sorely tested. Some nations, such as India, see the conflict as very much a European affair. Much of Africa is similarly skeptical of falling full square behind the United States and its friends, perhaps with the echo of being described unflatteringly, to say the least, by former President Trump in 2018, still ringing in their ears. Many also remember the support they received from Russia during their struggles for independence and the nation building that followed. So what can the Biden administration do to bring more countries on side? Let's try and pick this one apart. In Washington, D.C., we have Joel Hickman, Deputy Director of the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. To London, Domitilla Sagramoso joins us once again, Senior Lecturer at King's College London. Also in the UK capital, Alex Vines, Director of Africa Program at Chatham House. Great to have you all on board. Domitilla, let me ask you first of all, the question I posed there was, what more can the West do to stop those that are vacillating or those that are directly against any condemnation from the West? What more can it do to bring them on board?
Well, I think it's difficult because now it seems that a bit of the momentum that existed initially in terms of support to Ukraine and the Western position globally has been a bit lost. But of course, there is pressure that can be exerted over countries, for example, such as Turkey, threatening sort of secondary sanctions. I think that is something that has an impact, for example, on countries such as China, who are a bit concerned that they might be sort of caught up in this sort of net of secondary sanctions. So I think there is something that can be done, especially when we think about sort of the bigger traders and the bigger consumers of Russian energy resources.
Have there been any defectors, if you like, those that were on the West side, if you want to call it that now seem more inclined to back Russia?
I don't think this has happened. I think that the camp of the West, particularly in terms of European Union member states, other European countries such as the UK, the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, they've all been supportive. There was a sort of a motion in the UN General. It's going to come to the General Assembly, but it was first presented to the entire group by Ukraine, and it was supported by mostly European countries, Western countries, Japan, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia and Japan. So I think sort of this sort of alliance of so-called Western developed democracies is still holding. I think the question is now to what extent this is going to continue during the winter, when there is going to be a lot of pressure over increasing energy prices, and there's going to be pressure on governments to sort of try to see if by sort of easing sanctions on Russia, some kind of trade in energy can be reestablished. But I think this is going to be very unlikely.
Joel, I'll come to you on that in just a moment, wavering perhaps within Europe. But Alex, I want to come to you first of all. You mentioned Domitilla at the UN in March, the resolution condemning Russia, quoting aggression and demanding withdrawal from Ukraine, saw India and 17 African nations abstain, together making up half of all abstentions. Why would you think Africa is a continent apparently of such indifference to what is happening?
I don't think it's indifference at all. I think it's about non-alignment. and it's about not getting pigeonholed. So one African country sided with Russia, that's Eritrea, and they are a country that's, they are forever exceptionalistic. But everybody else either voted for the resolution or abstained, or didn't abstain, went off for a cup of coffee. And the second resolution that I think is very telling, which is the one on around the Russia on the Human Rights Council, you get an even more stark situation of 35 African countries abstaining, 9 opposed, and 10 supporting the resolution. And I think that gives you a sense of the direction of travel of Africa, where the default instinct for most countries is non-alignment. So abstention is the default.
Is non-alignment simply another way of saying I'm looking after myself, Jack?
Non-alignment served Africa well during the Cold War. And so sometimes there will be transactional politics, and that'll be really what's Russia offering us, or what's the West offering us in particular. But you're absolutely right. Otherwise, it will be, we don't want to get pigeonholed. This is not our battle, and therefore we'll stay out of it, and we'll either abstain or we'll go off and have that cup of coffee.
Okay. Joel, let me come to you. G20 appears pretty much divided. Only half the bloc has imposed penalties. We're looking at a map now on Russia for invading Ukraine. No sanctions from India, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, to name one or two. What do you think when you're looking at Europe and it seems to be united on this? And you hear that Germany isn't sending everything it said it would do to Ukraine. It's sort of vacillating here, there and everywhere. Are there cracks appearing?
I think on sanctions and, calling Russia out, I think you do need to look at each country individually on its own merits when it comes to that. I think some countries do have close historical ties to Russia, but many more are completely reliant on its essential commodities, such as gas, oil, grains, fertilizer, arms in the case of India. But we should remember that countries representing 60 to 70% of global GDP have sanctioned Russia. So that's certainly not insignificant. I think just touching upon your previous question, I do think it's unrealistic to expect developing countries to immediately apply the same level of sanctions on Russia as, say, the US or Europe, where many are reliant on those essential commodities, as I say. It's a bit like the climate debate when you hear the argument about developing nations and whether they should reduce their carbon emissions at the same speed as wealthier nations. I think going back to your question on Europe, I think Europe is the global exception when it comes to sanctions policy. We've seen Europe take quite extraordinary decisions, really, which have severely impacted their interests and their economies in the short term in terms of sanctioning gas and oil imports. And they've done that because, well, they believe it's the right thing to do. They want to punish Russia, but they also want to dissuade Russia and dissuade other countries around the world from undermining the rules-based international
But what I'm
order.
wondering, looking at these individual countries, as you say, we can't just look at the European Union. You have to look at powerful countries within that bloc, such as Germany. And Germany's going to suffer as probably more than most countries when it comes to an energy shortage. It promised arms to Ukraine. It hasn't delivered on them because it's worried about the effects of doing that, whereas the UK and other countries have been shipping goodness knows how much stuff over there. Germany might be considered to be a weak link in this.
Well, I think Germany's taken, like the rest of Europe, has taken an extremely principled stand, and I think we should congratulate Germany for doing that. I think, if you look at the pledges that Germany made in terms of its defence spending commitments, the 2% and the 100 billion modernisation programme immediately following the invasion back in February and March, that's a game changer, if you like, for Europe and European defence. And I think Germany does need to play a leadership role going forward. And yes, Germany has been one of the more reliant countries, let's say, when it comes to Russian gas and oil. But they've led the way when it comes to the EU sanctions. I mean, the EU has agreed, let's not forget, to ban 90% of Russian oil imports by the end of this year, and all gas imports from Russia by the end of 2027. Now, that will have a huge detrimental effect on the Russian economy. 90% of Russia's gas infrastructure and pipelines that go to Europe, they don't go to Africa or South America. Even if it was possible to build pipelines of that length, Russia doesn't have the money to pay for it, and it takes years to build. So I think Europe has taken some pretty bold decisions, and we should congratulate Europe for doing that.
Okay, Domitilla or Alex, do you want to either disagree with me and my suggestion that Germany is showing itself to be perhaps a weak link in this, or do you want to follow up on any of those points? Domitilla first.
No, I certainly agree with the previous speaker, and there is a bit this idea that Germany is not providing any kind of weaponry, which is not correct. Germany is providing weaponry. It is promising, and it is delivering, maybe not as strongly as we expected, but of course there is a whole process of rearmament there, which is necessary first. I think that Germany also has been quite effective at reducing the purchases, for example, of Russian gas. It's now, it was 40%, it's now around 9%. So I think that there is sometimes a temptation to constantly sort of blame Germany for not being too proactive. I think the foreign minister of Germany has been very vocal in terms of presenting a very strong hard line vis-à-vis Russia.
Alex, I want to come to you. Let's put a map up of a number of countries that support Russia. I'll just run through a list in no particular order. Syria, Belarus, Myanmar, you already mentioned Eritrea, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. And now I want to hear from the US ambassador to the United Nations.
If a country decides to engage with Russia where there are sanctions, then they are breaking those sanctions. They're breaking our sanctions, and in some cases they're breaking UN sanctions with other countries, and we caution countries not to break those sanctions, because then if they do, they stand the chance of having actions taken against them for breaking those sanctions.
Alex, there she is suggesting that if a country supports Russia through whatever means, and it is not being sanctioned, then it could face penalties itself. It's a kind of threat, isn't it, to those countries that are saying, listen, we're on your side to Russia?
Yeah, it is a threat, and it's not just her. A number of Western policymakers have been making that suggestion that if you're not for us, you're against us. But as I've already argued, I think in the global south that doesn't land very well. And the instinct there is not to get pigeonholed into one particular position. So, for example, Linda Thomas Greenfield was suggesting that Mozambique should not buy subsidized oil from Russia, which caused a massive debate in Mozambique. I was there for it. I've only just come back from the country. And it strengthened the pro-Russian lobby, because it was seen as a kind of neo-imperial statement by the United States, without understanding the difficulties with spiking energy prices and inflation that a country like Mozambique, which is one of the poorest in the world, is facing. So again, I think this is where Western policymakers are going to have to be clever and more nimble in the way that they frame this contest with Russia.
Joel, what do you make about the fact that Putin may have gambled that the West resolve would actually crack because of Western inaction in Syria, US failure, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., France having to retreat out of Mali, etc., etc. What do you think he would have made of that? Would he have seen an opportunity that perhaps hasn't been realised?
Yes, I think he's made a massive miscalculation. I think he would have expected Europe over time to have splintered. I think part of that calculation would have been much of Europe's reliance, as I say, on Russian gas and oil supplies. We've seen the EU take a very strong stand, as I say, in terms of cutting imports of both of those commodities going forward. And we've seen an extremely united front in NATO. And let's not forget that, traditionally neutral or non-aligned countries such as Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, they've all taken a very strong stand as well against Russia. So Switzerland's adopted the same level of EU sanctions in the banking and finance sectors in Russia. And you've seen Finland and Sweden, of course, join NATO, which is historic. Sweden was militarily non-aligned for 200 years. So it's quite incredible the degree to which Putin has unified the Western alliance. And I think, looking at the bigger picture, let's look at where the Russian economy is right now. Over 1,000 multinational companies accounting for nearly 40% of GDP in Russia have fled since the invasion. Imports are down 50%, including from China. Of the 600 billion or so foreign exchange reserves they had before the war, half of that's been frozen. And they're spending through the rest, I think 75 billion since March, to sustain their war effort in Ukraine. And as I say, the biggest trading partner, the EU, has essentially slammed the door shut.
Joseph Borrell, Europe's head of foreign policy, if you like to call him that. He has a proper title, but I can't directly remember it. Domitilla said, holding the bloc together is a day-to-day struggle. What sort of tensions do you think there will be?
I think there are going to be tensions around sort of potentially lifting some of the sanctions and reestablishing effective energy trade with Russia. But here the problem is that also Russia is the one that is sort of blocking this gas trade with Europe. It is Russia which has decided not to deliver the promised deliveries of gas. It is Russia which is not sort of trying to utilize sort of the gas weapon to exert pressure on European countries. So I think that there is a hope, and I think an illusion among certain countries or certain constituencies in European countries, in Italy, for example, in particular, that potentially, you know, if some kind of ceasefire agreement is signed with Ukraine and the war is brought to an end, sort of energy ties can be reestablished with Russia. And I think this is not really going to happen. We're in a very different paradigm now. And I think that therefore this is going to be very challenging to explain to people that even if there is an end to sort of the violence as we see it now, you know, that this doesn't signify that we're going to see a return to where the situation was before February 2022. I think that nevertheless, I mean, there are going to be initiatives, for example, if there is a new government in Italy that is sort of dominated by the right, especially there are parties such as Berlusconi's party and also Lega, led by Salvini, who have certainly an intention to sort of see if they can become brokers of negotiations. And that is going to cause tension with countries such as Poland, for example, which you know, wouldn't want to see some kind of ceasefire agreement being signed. So I think that a lot of the tensions are going to be around what is happening on the ground in Ukraine and pressures to force Ukraine maybe to sign some kind of ceasefire agreement. And some countries like the Baltic states, the Finns, the Danes, the Poles and the Brits saying, no, you know, we really cannot agree to that, and not putting pressure on Ukrainians. And I think that is going to, in a way, win the day.
Okay,
so
can we just for a moment try and look at both the moral and the philosophical side of the debate and the practical side? I want to ask you, Alex, first of all, South Africa. It has not imposed any sanctions at the moment. We know it's had strong links in the past with the former Soviet Union, with Russia. Going to the transactional side of things, what would it take for that country to change?
I don't think it will ever vote for the West. It would be because of the emotional ties from the Soviet period, when the Soviet Union supported the African National Congress, the party of government, quite deeply and consistently, unlike the West, which was all over the place in terms of supporting apartheid in part. So it would need a change of government in South Africa. So the ANC would need to lose, I think, to see a change of position. Now, South Africa is different from a lot of other African countries, which will be more transactional, more discerning. But the fundamental tie between South Africa and the Russian Federation is a historic, emotional one. It's about history. Which side and where did you stand on the fight against apartheid?
If we look at the bigger map of the African continent, I'm going to try and draw in Saudi Arabia into this. I don't know whether you want to come into it, but as a member of the G20, it also hasn't imposed sanctions. What would it take for that country to do it? Is that one for you, Alex, or anywhere else? Yeah, you carry on. You want to say something?
Yeah, so I mean, I think each country has its own interests and will look at its position on a case-by-case basis. So I think we're going to be seeing more and more a la carte foreign policy. No set menus here. Choose which issue and at what moment will you side with the West or whether you will abstain. I think it's very rare that you will actually vote in support of the Russian Federation. You've named that list: Syria, Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea. Very few will actually do that.
Can we consider this for a moment? We've talked about transactional nature of whatever is going on in the world. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. How rich a country, Joel, do you have to be to take a moral view of what is happening?
Well, I think that's a really insightful question, actually. It kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how Europe has been a kind of outlier in being able to take the decisions it has, which have undoubtedly harmed their economic interests in the short term. And they've done that based on democratic principles and values in a way that it's much harder for developing nations to do, given their reliance on the essential commodities I talked about. I think Saudi Arabia is an interesting example, actually. I think the 2021 US ban on offensive weapon sales to Saudi Arabia has opened the door for Russia to develop a closer trade relationship with Saudi Arabia. Like India, Saudi Arabia is very reliant on imports of weapon systems and arms because they have no domestic defense industry to speak of. And I guess one of the major advantages that Russia has in its dealings with trade partners is its general indifference to human rights abuses, which is what's hampered EU and US weapon sales in recent years to the likes of Nigeria and Saudi Arabia. But I believe the White House actually will overturn that decision. I'm seeing reporting of them overturning that decision in regard to Saudi Arabia. And I think part of the calculation will be the opportunity to dent Russian arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So I would expect Saudi Arabia to actually continue its major defense relationship with the US going forward. I don't see Russia kind of making a big dent in that.
Fascinating. Quick final word from you, Domitilla, in just a moment. That's after we've heard from the former Ecuadorian foreign minister.
A lot of Latin Americans feel and think that sanctions are applied in a sort of selective, politicised way, with a lot of double standards. Basically a tool of the US hegemony, rather than a tool of global justice.
True or false what he's saying, Domitilla?
Well, I think that for Europe it is a matter of moral justice, but also a matter of upholding international law. And I think this is one of the strongest arguments that should be put forward to countries. Of course, with the understanding that many cannot afford to impose sanctions on Russia. But this is really about upholding the international legal order. And in terms of Europe, it's protecting its own security. So it's extremely serious. It's not a faraway conflict for countries that, doesn't mean much. I mean, this could open the door to other countries taking similar initiatives. And therefore, I think it needs to be explained that besides the moral dimension and the atrocities that are being committed by Russia militarily, but also in the occupied areas, is something that we can no longer tolerate. And that there is a real danger that if this is not countered, then other countries are going to do the same. And this is very, very risky and very dangerous.
But I suppose one of the points that is being hinted at there is that powerful countries can use conflicts such as this to redraw the global map in a way that suits them, as was done post-1945. Is that likely at all here?
I don't really understand that line of argument. I mean, what we need to do is to stop this sort of decision by countries that are powerful, such as Russia, to redraw borders. This is something that we cannot accept, not in Europe and not in other countries. I mean, we need to insist that any change of borders, if it takes place, it is carried out in a peaceful, legal manner, with the acceptance of the countries involved. And I think this is something that is extremely important. And I think it should be taken on board there are territorial disputes all over the world. This is not something that is unique to the European continent. And it could really open a Pandora box. There are many territorial disputes, throughout the world. And that's why it's so important to uphold international law. And I think this is something that needs to be clearly explained, and the message needs to come across. Besides, as I say, the high level of atrocities that are being committed by Russia and by the occupying forces in the areas that go all the way from Luhansk to Kherson to Zaporizhzhia, Melitopol. I mean, in every city was reading reports yesterday about, concentration camps, atrocities of people being interned, disappeared, tortured. Children being separated from their families, sent in faraway areas of Russia. This is something that we need to highlight constantly to make people understand that this is not just a power contest between Russia and the West or Russia and the United States. This is a serious security concern and a moral issue which should, affect all countries globally and especially make people think, what is the point of aligning ourselves with regimes such as Russia?
I have to stop you. I really have to stop you there, Domitilla. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all my panelists for coming on this edition of Roundtable. We could talk for a very long time. No doubt nations around the world will, perhaps for many years to come, about this particular issue. From me, David Foster, thanks for watching Roundtable. Hope to have you with us next time. Goodbye.